Hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, since I was already midway through my long, endless journey into talking about the classic early 1960s anthology series Thriller, hosted by Boris Karloff, I thought that why not? Now would be a wonderfully opportune time to make even more work for myself and start talking about yet another beloved anthology series, one that I actually adored as a kid and have watched many times over, like in the ensuing years. So, Night Gallery ran on NBC from late 1970 through mid 1973. And it was actually kind of like the spiritual successor, I feel like, of The Twilight Zone. It was obviously hosted by the legendary Rod Serling and featured a lot of episodes that Rod Serling wrote himself. Now, I kind of feel like Serling didn't have quite the amount of creative control on Night Gallery as he did on Twilight Zone, but his presence in the show was still very much front and center. And I have to say that as much as I completely love the earlier and, obviously culturally iconic Twilight Zone series, I've always vibed slightly harder with Night Gallery because their stories tended to be more macabre, like they tended more towards supernatural horror, whereas Twilight Zone, I kind of feel like tended a little bit more towards science fiction. Now, Night Gallery also did have some like similar things to what Twilight Zone would do, like kind of like dark fantasy maybe, or like morality tales. So they were kind of similar in that regard, but I do kind of feel like there was a lot more outright horror episodes like on Night Gallery than there was on Twilight Zone. Now, while I will eventually get into discussing the actual Night Gallery series proper, I'll probably just talk about like one episode at a time, like, because, in the Thriller ones, I've been doing like 6 episodes at a time, which is kind of like a big endeavor. But the thing about Night Gallery is that each episode was like 2 or 3 stories, so I'll probably just like break down one episode like per video or whatever. But before I do that, I actually wanted to discuss the pilot, which aired in 1969 as essentially like a full-length movie featuring 3 stories that ran about 30 minutes each. Now, the conceit of this film, and largely the series that sprang from it, was that Rod Serling would introduce each story by showing this like really creepy painting that was related to the story that you were about to see. Now, in the series proper, the stories themselves didn't necessarily have anything to do with a painting per se, but the pilot episode, the movie, actually did theme all 3 segments around a different piece of artwork, so they all had to do with a painting. So I always thought that was kind of like a neat idea. I realize that it's not sustainable like over the length of a whole series because it did run for 2 seasons, but I like that they really leaned into that concept like just for the movie. The paintings in the pilot, by the way, and I think like a lot of the paintings that turned up throughout the series, were done by an artist whose name I'm sure I'm gonna butcher, but it's, I think, Yaroslav Geber. I'm not real sure if that's anything approaching like what his last name is. It's Geber, so I don't know. But the paintings are quite awesome. Matter of fact, like so many of the paintings that they showed during the course of the series, like really kicked ass. And I think I've thought about like eventually I want to print them out and like frame a bunch of them and like make my own little Night Gallery. Because I kind of feel like a lot of those paintings made a big impression on me like when I was a kid because they were so cool looking and spooky. This pilot, incidentally, is also quite notable for containing a segment that was the directorial debut of some little nobody that I'm sure you've never heard of named Steven Spielberg, who was then a fresh-faced 22-year-old child. The same segment that Steven Spielberg directed also featured one of the final acting performances of Hollywood icon and wire hanger hater Joan Crawford, who actually tried to get Spielberg replaced because of his inexperience. Like, it was kind of one of those, I don't want to be directed by this kid kind of thing. But she did eventually give him a chance, and it ended up actually that the two of them, they got along like a house on fire, and actually they corresponded for many years, like until she died. So I thought that was a nice little, even though she was kind of like snooty at first, like, I don't want this child telling me what to do, blah, blah, blah. But they actually did become friends later on. So anyway, the first story in the Night Gallery pilot is, spoiler alert, my favorite, mostly because it has Roddy McDowall in it, and I love Roddy McDowall, and he's just playing such a great character. He's just so evil. He's just like such a shithead, and he's just, you can tell that he's just relishing playing this just fucking shithead of a character. It's just so campy, and it's just like so deliciously evil. I just totally love it. And I also love that he's kind of matching wits with Ossie Davis's character, because I love Ossie Davis as well, who plays this very proper and indignant sort of character, but he's also like super conniving. And, you know, I really love like this kind of gothic, eerie cemetery setting. And I mean, the story itself is pretty straightforward, but it is like really effective and really entertaining. So this segment was actually directed by Boris Sagal, who did a lot of TV, including some Twilight Zone episodes, but he also directed the outstanding 1971 film The Omega Man with Charlton Heston, or the Cheston, as we sometimes call him, which of course was based on Richard Matheson's seminal novel I Am Legend. So in this first segment, which is just called The Cemetery, there's this wealthy old man named William Hendricks, and he lives in this big mansion right by the family graveyard. Now, he has a faithful manservant, retainer, I'm not really entirely sure what you would call that, and that's played by Ossie Davis, and his name is Osmond Portafoy, which is a pretty fantastic name. So this guy has taken care of the old rich dude for decades, but now it appears that the old man is, you know, getting ready to pop his clogs, if you want to say that. His time is running short. Now, the only joy, apparently, that the old man finds these days is in his painting. And so he has, like, examples of his own work, like stuff that he's painted, like, hung all around this house, which is, like, a really cool, awesome, like, it looks like a plantation house type of thing. But, yeah, he's got, like, all his paintings all over, like, on display. However, like a vulture circling a dying wildebeest, the old man's nephew, Jeremy Evans, who's played by Roddy McDowall, kind of sleazes into the mansion, and he's just being as aggressively douchey as it's possible to be. I mean, and he's really laying that southern accent on thick, which I kind of love. So it turns out that Jeremy's mom, who was obviously William's sister, was actually supposed to be the main beneficiary of the old man's estate, like, upon his death. But, wouldn't you know it, she actually died before he did, which means that according to the will, the estate would then pass to her next of kin and the old man's only living relative, who happens to be Jeremy himself. Now, it's left unclear. I don't remember if this was ever even brought up as a possibility. But you don't ever really know if Jeremy had actually had something to do with causing his mother's death. Like, I kind of doubt it, but he's such a shit that it honestly wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think they really go into that. But as soon as he arrives at this house, he just wastes absolutely no time in basically telling Portafoy, the manservant, he's like, well, I really hope my uncle kind of does me a solid and drops dead, like, sooner rather than later so I can get the money. So then he basically makes himself at home in the mansion. Like, he gets drunk and, like, brings women home at all hours of the night. Like, he just talks openly about how rich he's going to be when the old dude cacks. And he just starts, like, bossing Portafoy around like he's the fucking lord of the manor or whatever. And meanwhile, like, Portafoy is just over here quietly seething, not really able to do much of anything. So because Uncle William apparently isn't croaking fast enough, Jeremy decides he's going to help nature along a little bit. So he knows that his uncle is actually really susceptible to cold, so he purposely leaves the old man, who's kind of like an invalid, he's like in a wheelchair, next to an open window, like on a really, really frigid day for several hours. And, you know, in due course, William does indeed pass away in a manner that still retains some measure of plausible deniability. Like, it could have just been an accident or something like that, even though everybody in the house is like, yeah, we know what the fuck happened. So before the body is even cold, or colder, I guess, because he kind of froze to death, Jeremy informs Portafoy that he's read through the part of the will that was left in his uncle's desk, and the will says that the whole estate passes to his next of kin, which would be Jeremy, except for a measly $70 a month stipend for Portafoy. Now, the manservant is, like, seemingly appalled that all of his years of faithful service would just be met with such an insulting amount, like it's such a slap in the face. So he basically is like, well, shit, now I'm going to be poor. So he very grudgingly asks Jeremy if he can keep his job at the mansion, you know, which is an arrangement that Jeremy very magnanimously agrees to. Shortly after the uncle dies, however, shit starts getting strange around the plantation house. Now, the last painting that the uncle did was a view of the cemetery outside from his bedroom window. And this painting hangs on the wall, like along the staircase, along with a bunch of other ones. Jeremy notices, though, that this painting has changed slightly since he first got there. Like, when he first arrived, it just showed like a normal looking graveyard. But now, one of the graves in the foreground, like the one where, like near where his uncle was buried, has a little like tump of dirt and a little shovel in front of it, as though there's like a recent burial that took place there. So Jeremy's kind of like wigged out. He's like, hey, look, like the painting changed or something like that. But Portafoy's like, no, the painting doesn't look any different than it did before. You know, maybe Jeremy's guilty conscience is causing him to see things or something like that. So as the story goes on, the painting seems to be changing like every time Jeremy looks at it. Like in the next instance, his uncle's casket appears to be like poking out of the ground. And at that point, Jeremy like really flips out and he tosses the painting like into the fireplace. Not too long after that, though, the painting is hanging back in its regular spot again, and this time the little casket is open and his uncle's body is just laying in it with his arms all folded, and it's like super creepy. So when Jeremy next looks at it, I mean, and he's obviously aghast because he was sure that he burned it, you know what I mean? The picture actually appears entirely back to normal. So Jeremy is just getting more and more terrified and angry and like thinking he's losing his marbles or something like that. And I mean, Portafoy keeps telling him that the painting hasn't changed at all and Jeremy must be imagining things. So at this point, Portafoy, you know, kind of citing Jeremy's, what seems to be his slipping sanity, and also he's, you know, real abusive and he's just like a dick. So Portafoy quits his job and leaves Jeremy alone in the house with his supposed delusions. He also says something to Jeremy, which I actually really liked. He said, well, William needed me when he was alive, but now that the old man's dead, he seems like he's pretty capable of taking care of himself. So bye. It's kind of that kind of situation. So Jeremy is now completely alone in the middle of the night, and he hears like some creepy noises downstairs in the house. And he goes down there to find that the painting actually now shows his uncle fully out the grave and making his way through the cemetery gate and like toward the front of the house. Like he's just walking out there to see what's what. So he starts to panic, like he tries to call Portafoy at the town hotel because that's where he said he was going. But the desk clerk, you know, after all the ranting, he's just like, whatever, bro, and just like hangs the fuck up on him. And then he notices when he comes back into the room that in the painting now, the uncle is actually much closer to the front door. So he starts hearing creaking like somebody's in the house, and then like he sees an open window like in the parlor. So he's like, oh, well, I got an idea. I'll call the cops and tell them to come out right away because there's an intruder. So they seem to like, or they're going to do that, but it's going to take them a while to get there because, you know, the mansion's kind of isolated. Now, this whole sequence is actually really great. I mean, Roddy McDowall, he really sells the terror here, like especially after he starts hearing like scratching and like pounding at the door, like somebody or something is trying to get in. Like he runs over to the stairs and like looks at the painting again, and now in the painting, like his uncle is now standing on the porch like with his arm raised, like he's the one knocking at the door. And indeed there is like a knocking sound at the door, and he just like fucking loses it completely. And in his hysteria, he actually ends up tumbling down the stairs and breaking his neck, which kills him instantly. So after that point, like the front door opens very slowly, and we then discover that the person pounding on the door is in fact Osmond Portafoy, who, again, spoiler alert, orchestrated this whole scheme, which is pretty clever. You know, I'm just gonna say. It turns out that he spent his entire life savings, which I think was about $8,000, to hire an artist named Gibbons to paint 15 different versions of the cemetery painting. And then he either had, they don't really go into this, but he either had somebody switch them out like at opportune times, or he did it himself. I mean, it's not really the most plausible scenario, especially during the final sequence when Jeremy was like really only out of the room for like a couple of minutes at a time, but it's fine. Just like roll with it. See, the part of the will that Jeremy didn't get to or just skimmed over or whatever stipulated that if all of William Hendricks's living heirs were dead or, you know, were not able to get the money somehow, then the entire estate would actually pass to Portafoy after 6 months had passed. So Portafoy is like, you know, expositing all this to the artist. Now the artist says, well, what would you have done if Jeremy hadn't very fortuitously like fallen down the stairs and broken his neck? But Portafoy said, well, even if that hadn't happened, then Jeremy would have been driven insane by the fear that his uncle was coming back from the dead to get him. So he would have, gone crazy and he would have been committed. And that circumstance would also allow the money to pass to him because he would be non compos mentis or whatever. So clearly Portafoy had all this very meticulously planned out. And, good for him, I'm going to say. Yeah, it wasn't the most ethical way to go about things, but I kind of figure he had some reward coming for taking care of that rich old fart for 30 years, so... But no, unfortunately. The story actually could not let Portafoy get away with shit. His crime could not go unpunished. This honestly kind of bummed me out, but, that's just the way TV was in the 60s. You couldn't let bad people get away with bad things, even if they seemed like they kind of deserved it, because the story has yet another twist. And it kind of refers back to something that Portafoy said earlier about hatred being stronger than death. He actually said it to freak Jeremy out, obviously, but I guess it ended up being truer than he realized because, just as before, the painting on the staircase starts to change, every time Portafoy looks at it now. Only this time, it's Jeremy crawling out of his grave and walking toward the door, and this time, Portafoy didn't pay anyone to do the painting. So this is obviously some real supernatural shit going on. That's what happens when you fake supernatural shit, and then the real supernatural shit comes in, and it's yeah, this is how it's done. So Portafoy actually gets killed by zombie Jeremy, and the uncle's estate presumably just hangs in escrow for all eternity. Like I said, I admit that I kind of wish that Portafoy had gotten away with the whole plot, mainly because he was so loyal and so likable, and Jeremy was such a chode. I didn't really like that he kind of got the last laugh, even though he's dead, but I mean, he came back from the dead and blah, blah, blah. But, oh well, what are you gonna do? I mean, the double twist was sort of a nice touch, and I admit that I did not see it coming, the first time I viewed this episode, although probably modern viewers will see where it's going, you know what I mean? So, the second segment, which is just called Eyes, is the one that was directed by Steven Spielberg, as I mentioned earlier, and it's also pretty great, and it also involves a wealthy shithead who kind of takes advantage of someone less fortunate, so there's that little thematic kind of thing running through here. So Joan Crawford is in this one, and she plays this very imperious, very wealthy, pretty sociopathic, gonna say, blind woman named Claudia Menlo. Now, she lives in this huge, sprawling penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City, in a building she owns, but she won't let anybody else live in it. So she has, this massive, apartment building, and she's the only one that lives there. Other than her servants, you know what I mean? Because, of course, she has servants. So at the beginning of the story, her physician, Dr. Heatherton, is coming to see her. And in the elevator, he meets an artist who's leaving her apartment with a portrait of her that he's been working on. Claudia can't see the portrait, of course, because she's been blind since birth, but that's where the good doctor comes in. See, the doctor knows about a very experimental surgical technique that might be able, in theory at least, to restore sight by kind of like grafting in optic nerves from a donor. Now, the surgery has only been successfully performed on 2 animals so far. I think he said it was a chimpanzee and a dog or something like that. And there are a couple of catches. In one instance, the animal subject's sight was restored, but only for a few minutes. And then in the other instance, the animal could see for several hours, but then lost the ability again. So it's not permanent, in other words. Also, a little side thing there is that the animals that were used as donors were actually rendered permanently blind. Claudia doesn't give a shit about any of that, though. She wants Dr. Heatherton to do the surgery on her so that she can look at her portrait and see, I mean, she wants to look at other things too, but she basically wants to look at her portrait and see if it's done her justice. One line of dialogue she says in there that should kind of let you know the kind of asshole that you're dealing with is she says something like, "In all my 54 years, no one's ever done me justice, not even God." So she's a very wealthy, poor me kind of thing. So yeah, she's kind of insufferable. She does not care that the sight will only be temporary, and she cares even less that the person that they're going to use as a donor will never be able to see again. So, clearly Claudia is the most important person to have ever existed in the history of mankind, and everybody else on the planet is just incidental to her wants and whims, and that's just how she sees things. So the doctor tells her straight up, he's like, "Look, even on the off chance that the surgery works, because we've never done it on a person, you'd only be able to see for maybe 12 hours, best case scenario. And he's like, and the whole point's really moot anyway, because you're never going to be able to find a donor that will part with their eyesight for the rest of their life just so a snotty rich lady can look at some shit for a few hours. But Claudia tells him, au contraire, that's where you are wrong. Everybody has a price. And as a matter of fact, she has absolutely already located a person who is sufficiently desperate for money, and they're going to give up their optic nerves for her. Her lawyer, she says, represented this guy in a criminal trial sometime back, and the man is in really, really bad, like, financial shape. He owes thousands of dollars to a bookie who's basically threatening to wax him, like, if he doesn't pay up. So Claudia has agreed to pay this guy, who she calls, like, inconsequential. She's going to give him $9,000, which will clear his debts. And in turn, he has agreed to completely relinquish his sight from this point forward. So at this point, when she tells the doctor this, like, he realizes what a monstrous individual this bitch is. And he tells her in no uncertain terms, I will absolutely not be a party to taking away a person's eyesight just so you can stare at a painting of yourself. Okay, I'm just not doing it. It's like I would no more do that than I would kill a child. You know what I mean? But then Claudia pulls out the ace up her sleeve. She actually has solid proof that the doctor sent this young woman to like an illegal back alley abortionist at some point in the past, and the young woman ended up dying. So Claudia threatens to release this information to the public, which will obviously ruin his career because he's this very high-priced surgeon, and it will also probably ruin his marriage as well. So obviously she's blackmailing him. She's like, I'm going to tell everybody about this unless you do the thing. So he basically knows he's fucked, and he's like, okay, fine, you win, I'll do it. So the donor turns out to be this very kind of simple, sympathetic, kind of sad sack type of guy named Sidney, who's actually played by Tom Bosley. And he kind of tries to keep things in perspective. I mean, he doesn't really have a choice in the matter. He's going to get killed if he doesn't come up with this money, so he has to get it somehow, like immediately. But he says things like, in here, they take the eyes, out there, they take the body. Like, that's what he tells the surgeons, like, you know, kind of somewhat poignantly. He also figures that at this stage in his life, he's already seen everything good, and there's really nothing left in his life worth seeing. And he even kind of makes a joke about being the sight giver. So it's like very, like I said, it's very poignant. So the way he's talking makes Dr. Heatherton feel even worse about this whole deal than he already does. Like, especially when Sidney asks, will I still be able to cry out of my useless eyes? And also kind of implies that he'll probably end up killing himself, like, at least 24 hours, like, you know, after they make him blind. I'm going to say, like, Tom Bosley is absolutely great here. He's such a likable actor that you really kind of like feel for his character. And it's like really, it's super heart-wrenching, like watching him go through this process of realizing what exactly it is that he's giving up and kind of twigging onto the fact that like desperation has led him to this tragic, horrible state of affairs. And it's almost kind of like, well, I kind of did this to myself sort of thing. Meanwhile, Claudia has this really intricate plan for all the things she's going to look at, like once she gets her sight back. Well, she doesn't get her sight back because she's never been able to see, but once she's given sight, okay. So, and she says, you know, in the 12 hours that I can see, I'm going to commit every single thing that I see to memory so that for the rest of my life, you know, after I go blind again, I can reflect back on it and like just remember what it's like in my mind's eye. So she even sets everything up that the first thing she'll see when she removes the bandages is the portrait of her that now like hangs on the wall of her penthouse. Now, after the doctor is like at her penthouse and like gives her the lowdown on like what to expect and everything like that, she very coldly like just dismisses him. Like she compares him to a used light bulb. She straight up calls him a used light bulb. And she's basically like, yeah, we'll never see each other again, so bye. You know, yeah, real peach this one. So because you just knew that this is one of those stories that had to have an ironic twist to this whole thing, it turns out that only moments after Claudia removes the bandages from her eyes, and it seems as though the surgery has worked, like it's still kind of like fucked up because obviously she's never been able to see and now she can see. And so she looks at like the chandelier and it's like, she's like, oh my God, it's coming in, it's coming in. But then like after a second or two, there's actually a citywide blackout. And since Claudia does not realize that that's what's going on, she actually believes that the doctor has either like fucked her over or messed up the surgery somehow, because like she's just surrounded by blackness, like she can't see a fucking thing. I mean, you would think that she would at least be able to see like the moon or the stars or something like that, like outside of her apartment window, but I don't know, like maybe all the curtains were closed or something like that, but it's just like totally pitch black in there, so she doesn't even realize that she can see anything. Now, not surprisingly, Claudia is very put out by this sequence of events, so she first kind of starts raging at the doctor for being a quack, and then like she starts sobbing and begging for him to come back and fix it and all this other kind of stuff. So after a while, she kind of like tears ass around the apartment. She can't see anything, obviously, so she's just like knocking shit over and breaking things and stuff like that. And then after this, she kind of seems defeated, and she sort of like collapses in her chair and falls asleep. But when the sun comes up, she realizes that the surgery did actually work. And she rapturously watches the sunrise over the New York City skyline. But by the time this happens, her limited window of sight, because remember, you know, she could only see for 12 hours, and 12 hours has passed, so her time is up, like it's been used up. So as she stares out the window, like just marveling over, it's like, oh my God, it's so beautiful, like the colors and everything like that, because she's never seen it before, her vision very gradually starts going dark once again, which makes her just start screeching about how unfair everything is, and like, oh my God, God hates me, blah, blah, blah. And while she's reaching toward the window, which was actually, I guess she like broke it like during her tirade like around the apartment, she actually falls forward and falls out the window. So, you know, splattering her rich white ass all over the sidewalk, several stories below, one presumes. Although obviously this movie was made for TV, so they can't show anything like that. So she never even got to look at her portrait before falling to her death, which, you know, that's another little twist there, which I kind of liked. Little twist of cruel irony. Incidentally, like Sydney's fate is actually never revealed, though because of the dialogue, I'm assuming that he probably did exactly like he said he was going to do and committed suicide after going blind, but they never do like resolve like what ended up happening to him, but I guess since they put that in there, that was the suggestion. So the third and final segment in the Night Gallery pilot movie is titled The Escape Route, and it was directed by Barry Shear. This was actually my least favorite of the three. Like, don't get me wrong, it's still really good. In particular, the outstanding lead performance by Richard Kiley, but the pacing seemed a little bit uneven to me, and I feel like the messaging was a little bit heavy-handed. The story here is like along the same lines as the Twilight Zone episodes. There was one called The Quality of Mercy, and there was one called Death's Head Revisited, which kind of had a similar like Nazi kind of theme, which this one does as well. So it's kind of similar to those. So Richard Kiley plays a fugitive Nazi war criminal named Joseph Stroba, and he's hanging out in South America like many real Nazis did back in the day. Now, I'm going to say, like, though it would be very easy for an actor to play a character like this as essentially like a straight up cartoon villain, you know what I mean? Because obviously. But I like that the actor goes more nuanced with it. And I'm not going to go as far as to say that you actually sympathize with the character exactly, especially like when you know what he did. You do actually see him as like a complex human being and not just as like a cardboard cutout or like a soulless monster. So I think that was like a really, really good, it's like a really good acting performance that actually humanizes a character that would be really, really difficult to humanize. But like I said, the script isn't asking you to sympathize with him, because you absolutely don't, but you do see him as a person and not like a monster. So this many years later, like after the war, Stroba is apparently somewhat haunted by his days as a lieutenant general in one of the camps, where he basically made the decisions about who was going to live and who was going to die at the particular camp that he was at. So he's having nightmares and PTSD flashbacks and things like that. And it seems like the only consolation that he can find is at a museum, like by his apartment, where he goes in there and he starts kind of like fantasizing about vanishing into this very calming, bucolic painting of a man fishing on a lake. You know what I mean? So it seems like Stroba, he just wants nothing more than to just revert to a simpler life where he never has to think about the atrocities that he perpetrated and like what a shitty person he is, even though he seems to understand that, at least from his perspective, that God will never allow him any such peace, like after what he did. Like, he does seem to realize that. Now, one day while he's in the museum, he actually meets a Jewish man named Bloim, I think is his name, Bloom or Bloim. I'm not really sure. I don't remember how they pronounced it. And he's looking at a painting that shows a man being crucified in one of the camps. Now, he mentions that he's like, yeah, I was in the camps as well, and I had a friend who died in like precisely this way. So this is, this painting really resonates with me. Now, at first, he doesn't recognize Stroba as one of the Nazis or, one of the tormentors or who worked at the camp. So he doesn't realize that at first. But not too long afterward, he actually does realize who Stroba is. And although, like the Nazi, he tries to deny it, but Bloom is pretty adamant that he's going to report Stroba to the authorities because there have been like 2 investigators that have been kind of lurking around like looking for him. Now, to keep this from happening, Stroba actually kills Bloom, which, way to compound the sin there, Chief. But in the end, the murder actually ends up being pointless because Stroba gets caught by the investigators anyway. So he pretty desperately tries to save his own skin by promising to give up some bigger ticket Nazis like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller, who, obviously were real Nazi war criminals that escaped to South America. So he's trying to give them up to the agents, like to maybe not get in as much trouble. But it seems that the investigators are not biting. Stroba actually does make a break for it, and he escapes them, however, and he runs to the museum like in a blind panic, and he just starts begging God to allow him to vanish into the peaceful fisherman painting, which happens to be situated in this very, very dark corner of the museum, because the museum is closed at this point. Well, Stroba does disappear, all right. When the agents kind of like follow him into the museum, they can find neither hide nor hair of him anywhere. But as astute viewers will have probably already guessed, the fishing painting that Stroba loved so much had actually been replaced in the spot where it was by the crucified man one. And Stroba couldn't actually tell them apart because the corner was too dark and he couldn't see. He just assumed that that's where the painting was before. So he went up there and it's like, I want to go in this painting. But yeah, it was a different one. And it was like, it was the scary crucified one. So yeah, God apparently did grant Stroba's wish, thrusting him into the crucifixion painting to suffer for all eternity. Like the face is changed in it to his face, and like the agents even kind of hear it's like, do you hear that? Like it sounds like somebody like, tormented in agony, like kind of coming out of the painting. So, good riddance, Nazi scum, pretty much. Now, as I mentioned, the fact that Richard Kiley plays such a shitty person, like such a terrible character with such subtlety, actually puts this one a notch above what it maybe would have been otherwise. Obviously we all love not seeing Nazis get a beat down. I'm not saying that, but this one just seemed a little too, like I said, a little too heavy-handed, a little too sanctimonious. And honestly, like, the story wasn't all that original. Like I said, they did this a couple of times on the Twilight, like similar type of stories, like they did this on the Twilight Zone as well. And they even did a slight remake of it, like in Twilight Zone the movie in 1983, like the first segment about the guy who, that wasn't entirely about like Nazis. There was other stuff in there too, but it's kind of like a similar story. I mean, I still liked this one, but to be honest, I found my attention wandering like way more during this segment than during either of the other ones. I mean, the other two were just like, I was riveted the whole time, and this one I just kind of felt like I was kind of checking in and out because it seemed like it went on like longer than it needed to. So gonna say this pilot episode of Night Gallery is absolutely worth watching if you like anthologies, especially for the first 2 stories, which in my opinion are the best ones. I mean, I'm sure that like a lot of people probably think the third one is their favorite too, and that's totally legit. So as time goes on, I am planning on exploring the rest of the series as a whole, so be sure to keep watching this space. I don't know when I'll get around to doing it because I'm still working on Thriller, and I'm still working on some other things too, like my favorite horror movies from every year kind of series. So, but I'm just going to keep doing it. And I really do love Night Gallery. At least it's only 2 seasons, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Remember to like, share, and comment if you enjoy the content. And please subscribe to the Scare Salon if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.